On behalf of Center for Research in Rural and Industrial Development, Focus Group on Economic Growth and Sustainable Development of Chandigarh Citizens Foundation, and Mahatma Gandhi State Institute of Public Administration, Nobel Laureate and University Professor Kenneth C. Griffin, Department of Economics at the University of Chicago, who has consented to deliver a lecture on an issue of contemporary relevance, despite his compelling commitments. Ever since Schumpeter identified innovation as the critical dimension of economic change, the world has come a long way. Economics and policy innovation involves designing government frameworks to foster technological advancement, raise productivity, and drive sustainable economic growth. We are honored to have an illustrious economist sharing his thoughts on economics and policy innovation in India with us this morning. I am pleased to welcome a galaxy of civil servants, professors, distinguished members of the civil society, friends from the media, and young students who have got this opportunity very early in life to listen to a person of Professor Kremer's stature. Now I request Ms. Binny Mahajan, former Chief Secretary Punjab and Secretary Government of India, to formally introduce Professor Kremer to the audience. Binny ma'am.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the city, beautiful Professor Kremer, on this balmy spring morning, and welcome to the distinguished audience as well. This audience knows, but let me still say it. Professor Michael Kremer is one of the leading development economists in the world today. He has studied and taught at Harvard and is presently the university professor in economics at the University of Chicago. Professor Kremer was jointly awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2019, along with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Their work fundamentally transformed development economics by pioneering the use of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, to rigorously evaluate policy interventions in a host of fields, including education, health, poverty reduction generally. Today, these methods have become central to evidence-based policy making globally. Professor Kremer is also co-founder and director of the Development Innovation Lab at U Chicago, where he combines rigorous economic theory with field experimentation to address some of the most pressing development challenges of our time. We will hear about some of those things today. Professor Kremer has also played a pioneering role in innovation financing. He co-developed the concept of advanced market commitments, a mechanism that incentivizes vaccine development through legally binding purchase guarantees. This framework influenced global pneumococcal vaccination programs and later informed large-scale public-private partnerships during the pandemic. Amongst the host of organizations that he is associated with, he is the co-founder of the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, member of the National Academy of Sciences, fellow of the Econometric Society, long-standing associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has consistently bridged scholarship and practice, demonstrating how economics can directly improve human welfare at scale, and is naturally amongst the most cited development economists. Professor Kremer has been working intensively in many countries, including India. The Development Innovation Lab India brings researchers in different fields together with Indian government entities, firms, and nonprofits to use the tools of economic development advanced by Professor Michael Kremer to identify, test, refine, and scale interventions with the potential to benefit millions of people. This was the formal part. On a personal note, I have known Professor Kremer for many years now, with water quality issues bringing us together. I've always been deeply impressed by the breadth of his understanding, the breadth of the areas of intervention that he is working towards, the geographies that he's working in, but most importantly, the human being that he is. I believe that he is giving of his time and energy in the most significant manner to advance welfare, especially amongst the disempowered. It is a measure of his commitment that, in spite of the very packed schedule that he had on this India visit, he readily accepted the request to come to Chandigarh to deliver a lecture here. And not just that, he was supposed to fly in last evening. A sudden important meeting came up. He rescheduled. He took the Vande Bharat at the unearthly hour of 5:50 a.m. today morning from Delhi to reach here in time for it. Thank you, Michael. Really, really appreciate that. The creme de la creme of the region are here to listen to you today. Policymakers, academicians, including faculty from government colleges from all over the state of Punjab, doctors, business leaders, intelligentsia from all walks of life. And they've come to listen to Professor Kremer and not to me, so I should step back and hand back to Upinder. But a very, very warm welcome again to Michael, his team, and all of you.
Thank you so much for the very kind invitation. I'd like to speak today about ways to use the tools of economics for policy innovation. And I'll mostly focus on examples from the experimental method, but I'll talk about some other cases as well. I'll go through a few cases to illustrate this. One is where the experimental method was used to just evaluate the impact of a policy. And that's an example from many years ago of deworming. And this is something where India has the largest program in the world. That's a historical example, but then I'll turn to more contemporary examples, many of which involve technology and artificial intelligence in particular, where India is a leader in the world. And I'm going to focus on applications of artificial intelligence for public service delivery, because I think there's just huge potential in this area, but there's also some cases where additional adjustments and additional work will be needed. I'll start with the case of AI weather forecasts for farmers. I'll then move on to road safety, and then I'll turn to drinking water, where I've had the pleasure of working with Secretary Mahatma, and then I'll conclude by discussing educational technology. I think one theme that will show up across many of these areas is that there's a technological component which has the potential to be extremely cost-effective and to improve service delivery for citizens. But there's also work, in many of these cases, additional work will be required to figure out how this can be integrated into government structures. And that will require careful thought about delivery channels, management systems, procurement systems, and incentives. But I'll start off with a historical case where there's no IT component. And this is the case of school-based deworming. So this was a case where I was initially involved in, because I was involved in the evaluation of a program by a relatively small NGO in Kenya. And this was, so the program involves providing very inexpensive and well-tested medication against intestinal worms, like hookworm, whipworm, roundworm. They were very common in this part of Kenya, which is near a lake and near freshwater sources. The school, what we found was that in the set of schools where the NGO was very small, so it initially introduced the program in one set of schools, then expanded to another set after a second year, and then expanded further in year 4. So by comparing the schools that got this in year 1, after 1 year, to the schools that hadn't yet had the program phased in, we could evaluate the impact of the program. And what we saw in the short run was that children were much more likely to be at school. This was a period, this was more than 20 years ago, when school attendance was a major issue, and many students were missing school, they were dropping out, or they just were absent. Now later, we followed up these same students over time as they became young adults. And what we found was that the girls were more likely to finish primary school, continue on to secondary school. But we also saw that as they became young adults and entered the labor force, their income and consumption increased about 13%. Now the medication cost a few pennies. So from an economic point of view, the rate of return on this was very, very high. In fact, it's so high that the Kenyan government could have come out ahead if they borrowed the money for this. Just based on the additional tax revenue they would have collected, they could have repaid any loans with interest for this. So Kenya, based in part on these results, decided to start a national deworming program. And they did this in the parts of the country, obviously, where deworming was a problem. Later, the government of Bihar began state-level deworming program. And then in 2015, India introduced National Deworming Day. And according to government figures, this now reaches, I believe, 200 million children every year. So it's a very large program. Now my guess is that the prevalence of the worms was higher in this region of Kenya than it is for most of India. So I think the benefits for India will be not quite as large as they were for Kenya. But even if the benefits were a fraction this size, the benefit cost ratio would be huge. One estimate would be that the net benefits could be more than 2 lakh crore rupees between 2015 and 2024. So that's one historical example where a program's been fully scaled, and all of the issues involved in scaling that have been worked out by the government and implemented. Let me turn to a much more recent example where I think the government's made tremendous progress and is a world leader, but I also think that there's huge potential to do even more in the future. Before I turn to the India case in particular, let me just discuss some of the global evidence. So I recently chaired a global commission on innovation for climate change, food security, and agriculture. And this is an area where it's obviously a major problem for the world. There are a lot of calls for very, very large-scale investments. But part of what we were trying to do was to look for solutions that could be realistically implemented with amounts of funding that were realistic for governments to start spending in the short run. But we looked for evidence of innovations, policy innovations with evidence of impact and cost effectiveness, not just for the innovation itself, but also for ways to boost adoption. So not just new seeds that achieved were drought resistant, for example, but actually things where we knew farmers would be willing to adopt them, at least with some incentives. So we came out, our commission has a number of different recommendations, but one of the ones that had a particularly high benefit cost ratio was providing weather forecasts for farmers. And one of the reasons for this was that there are multiple randomized controlled trials from around the world, but also several in India, that show that if farmers are provided weather information, they react to that. They change their agricultural decisions. That might sound not surprising, that farmers, but there were some people who thought, farmers won't react. There are many other barriers farmers are facing, and surely there are. Farmers face many issues, but there's evidence from multiple contexts now that if they get weather information, they react to it. So a study in Telangana that provided farmers with information on monsoon onset dates found that farmers changed their behavior accordingly. In that study, the farmers got the information, in some cases, weeks in advance of monsoon onset, so they were able to, in fact, change their seed choice, change their investment level. Another study in Odisha was providing not just weather information, but agromet advice. There was a reduction in losses from extreme weather events, from flooding. Bihar flood forecast, this is a more recent study, found there was an improvement in health and a reduction in medical costs when farmers had advance warning of the flood. So, and then there are many studies outside India demonstrating many different ways that farmers react. So one way is if farmers know that it's going to be raining heavily the next day, well then they don't put out fertilizer or they don't put out pesticide because it would be washed away, and that way they save money. There's also environmental benefits because there's not the runoff. And they can apply this at the appropriate time. Another study in Bangladesh found if farmers knew whether the weather conditions were conducive to pests appearing, they could then make the right decisions and not unnecessarily use pesticides. A rough estimate of the benefits, and treat this as very rough, is 2,000 rupees per hectare across studies. This number, I don't want to claim that it's overwhelming, but the right way to think about this is not the benefits for each farmer 2,000 rupees. Rather, if there's a particular season with something unusual and that's forecasted, that may save those farmers much, much more. And then there'll be other times when the weather's fairly normal and the farmer doesn't really adjust their behavior and there's not that much impact. Okay. Let me also note that there's an AI revolution in forecasting occurring right now. There are many different open access models. So these are free for anybody to use, free for anybody to modify. They have high accuracy for many phenomena. Lead times have increased. And they're computationally much, much more efficient. They're 80,000 times faster. Why does that matter? Well, it's no longer necessary to have a supercomputer. These can be run on a desktop computer. And that means they can be tailored to needs of particular groups. So, for example, farmers might care about, they might not care about just when the rain start, but they might care about when does continuous rain start? Because if there's a dry spell afterwards, that might kill their crops might not germinate, and they may lose their crops. So they can be tailored to the specific needs much more easily. Particular combinations of variables can be forecast that are relevant for farmers or for other users. So I forgot to say a very important thing here. The government of India has had the largest dissemination of forecasts for AI-informed forecasts. They're really a combination of AI and physics-based models anywhere in the world. And last year, in 2025, 3.8 crore farmers got forecasts. The forecasts did very well. The monsoon last year, as you remember, arrived early in Kerala, but the northward progression paused for 10 days. And we had a little bit of a survey in Odisha, and the pause in the northward progression was predicted by the forecast that the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmer Welfare sent out. These are preliminary results, but it looks like in the areas, so in Odisha, there was, in the north, the state, the farmers got this information and had time to react to it. And there we found that they were 10% more likely to raise a nursery and transplant paddy, and they were 12% more likely to upgrade to hybrid seeds. So this is an example of the impact on farmers. We're doing additional data collection, so treat these as somewhat tentative. Now, I think there's many other things could be done in the future. For example, forecasts could be added throughout the agricultural season. You could potentially do soil moisture forecasts, do pest alerts. You could provide, heat can be a danger for crops, for livestock, for farmers as they do their agricultural activity. There are, of course, already heat warnings sent out by the IMD, but additional information, you could provide additional information incorporating things like humidity, night heat, wind speed, other things that might affect some of these risks. There's also things that can be done on the dissemination side. Message comprehension is very important. You can test messages to see which ones have the best comprehension, and you can optimize the dissemination channels. You can test combining weather forecasts and agricultural advice. And then I think, the other side of LLMs, of course, of AI, is large language models. And there's a major effort in India through Vistar that was just announced recently. And all of this information could be incorporated in Vistar, and then farmers could receive even more tailored advice for their situation. I'll discuss the example of road safety. We were looking for photographs. We didn't find the perfect photograph, but we found this one. Annually, there's over 150,000 deaths in India due to road crashes. Punjab is a leader in trying to quantitatively collect and analyze data. So the police have set up a research center on road safety and traffic. There's systematic data collection, and that enables evidence-based policies. So one application of AI is to improve transparency in driver's licenses. So Microsoft Research India developed a system called HAPS that's currently been rolled out in 56 RTOs. That app, as the driver drives the course, the system is picking up how well they're driving. And that helps automatically judge whether the driver satisfies the requirements. They found that after the introduction of HAPS system, the rate of passing the exam went down. So this was tougher than humans were, I guess. Now, does that have any impact on how drivers are behaving? Well, we partnered with Ola. This is not an experimental study. It's with somewhat, our method was somewhat analogous to difference methods, but I won't dwell on that here. What we did was we looked at places where the ham system was introduced before and after. We compared it to other areas where the system hadn't been introduced. We looked at the driving records for people who went through that system versus others who came in from outside. And our estimates are there's a 20 to 30% reduction in customer reports of unsafe driving. That's particularly concentrated among the young drivers. So over time, people learn to drive better. But particularly at the very initially, this system seems to be either keeping unsafe drivers off the road or getting them to go through additional training so they become better drivers before they start driving. So this is something that I think could have obviously health benefits. It's something that could have that can, I think, also for trust in government. If people are more convinced that this is an objective, fair system, that can be, I think, have further benefits for society. Now, here's another example, and we haven't evaluated this yet, but we look forward to doing so. NHAI is using cameras in highways and AI to identify traffic rule violators. That can reduce bias, remove some of the human discretion, and it can detect many more violators. I had the opportunity to visit one of these control centers, and the video screens, and they're taking the pictures, and the cameras are identifying the cases where people are driving too fast, or they're in the wrong lane, or not wearing seatbelts, etc. And it does this very rapidly. A human has to approve this before before Challan goes out. I think one key question here will be: this is, the simplest way to use this is to just send out the tickets. But then the question will be, what's the role of different enforcement approaches? Maybe if people don't have to pay this until they sell their vehicle, then that might not be such a strong incentive for better driving. There might be other systems to get higher rates of increase the extent to which the tickets go out and people have to pay them. That could lead to reform. But that in many cases, this type of traffic camera system can be politically controversial. Certainly, I've heard cases in Chicago where I'm from where it's controversial. Sometimes these are seen as being installed in poor neighborhoods, and poor people get hit by large fines, or relatively poor people. Now, a couple of reasons. One reason why that things might be a bit different in India is that many of the traffic deaths in India come from four-wheelers hitting either two-wheelers or hitting pedestrians. So in these cases, the victims are actually people who are probably lower income than the people who have the cars. So that might make I have no idea what the politics would be in India. I'm not a political scientist, but it at least opens up that possibility. But the other thing is that AI not only creates a new technology, but possibly a chance to reevaluate the system. So the equilibrium that the world was in before AI was that most people who committed traffic violations were not caught. It was unlikely you would be caught, so to deter bad violations, that you needed a large fine. And then if a household was hit by a fine, that would impose significant hardship in some cases. Obviously not for very high income people, but for a lot of ordinary people, it would impose significant hardship, and particularly for the poor. Well, there's at least the possibility, and I'm just throwing this out as a question, that maybe with AI, it would be possible to switch from high fine, and then of course if there's a high fine, that makes it that makes traffic police, it makes politicians reluctant to just send out a huge number of fines for this because they know they'll be disrupting a lot of lives. Well, you can imagine switching from a high fine with a low probability of detection to a much more modest fine with a larger probability of detection. I'm not, we haven't evaluated that policy. I'm not saying that would be desirable, but at least could be thought about. So for example, imagine you go through a toll gate, and one toll gate, it records the time you go through that, and then you go through another toll gate that's 50 kilometers down the road, but you've crossed that distance in a way that implies you must have been speeding at some point. I don't think that, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that there's at least a gray area in the law about whether you could be fined for that because you weren't observed at any one point going over the speed limit. But that might be something where some sort of administrative charge could be added. So you just get charged more for the toll. You get charged a higher toll if that were small, that would be something that people might be willing to accept, and that might still encourage better behavior, and therefore might be able to be applied more regularly. Okay. Let me talk about another case, that of safe drinking water. Here, start with some basic technology, but then talk about the possibility of AI technology and the role that could play. So as background, these are a bunch of randomized trials. We conducted a meta-analysis, and in fact, we're constantly updating this. But it looks like what these, I won't go through this in detail, but if you combine data from 19 different studies that we could find, it looks like water treatment reduces all-cause child mortality by about 20%. That implies that universal water treatment in rural India could avert 1 lakh deaths of under 5 every year, or more than that actually, which would make it extremely cost-effective. This is all made possible by JJM, which is installed piped water. So once piped water is in place, it's fairly inexpensive to add water treatment through chlorination. Here's one example of I'll show you a picture. There are multiple different technologies. This is just one of them. But it shows how simple the device can be. It's just you add some little section of pipe where there's, in this column, just put chlorine tablets. They drop down by gravity and they dissolve. Okay, some places you need fancier technology. It's a bit more expensive, electrochlorinators, but this shows how inexpensive it can be. Some piloting in Odisha and in Rayagada, 70% reduction in E. coli, which is an indicator of fecal contamination, and 47% reduction in stored water at the home. Now, generally, we found pretty high acceptance. Only about 10% of families experience an issue with taste. And this is a matter of, you have to get the dosage right. If it's too high, there's a taste problem. If it's too low, there's not a health benefit. So getting the dosage right is critical. But if there's even a small number of complaints to the pump operator, then they may drop this practice. So I think systems and ongoing incentives to maintain the devices, to refill them, to adjust them, because sometimes of the year there's more impurities in the water, and you have to increase the dose, sometimes you have to reduce it. Those will need to be in place, and that's not a trivial matter to have that operate at scale across the country. So what are some ways of doing this? Well, the community clearly plays an important role, and there are efforts to educate and sensitize the community that the government's undertaking. There may be a role for a water quality index akin to the air quality index that could, if there was a way to measure this, that could help inform communities, inform the public in general, and inform officials so that they could take action. I think some sort of incentives for pump operators may play a role, and there seems to be some interest in this approach. But of course, an incentive system requires high-quality monitoring data. So how could that be in place? Well, in the short run, you could have a system where, and there are some systems already, where the pump operators take a photo of what they've done to show that the chlorine tablets are in place, to show that they've, and record the other aspects of their job, not just on water safety, but more generally. And then that could potentially be linked to the payment. In the long run, this will require some R&D, but if you could have Internet of Things sensors that used AI to help monitor water quality. But R&D will be needed to improve the reliability of these and to cut the costs. And there's a number of different approaches, research approaches, that have been put forth. This may be, Secretary Mahatma gave the example of the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus. This might be another area where, because there are multiple different technological approaches, creating some sort of prizes or ultimately the promise of procurement or the prospect of procurement at a large scale across the state or across the country. That, if firms knew that if they produced a good sensor, they would have a good prospect of being able to sell it if it was reliable enough and if it was inexpensive enough, that would create the incentives to develop this type of sensor. And I think I'm optimistic that this could be done. So I think this is an area where a lot of research is done for certain purposes where there's a lucrative market, but there are other areas like this one where there's a tremendous social need, but the commercial incentives now are not as big. And I think to the extent that governments can signal, or governments or others can signal that there'd be a market for these devices, that could help harness the energy and creativity of the private sector to address some of these challenges. Let me discuss another example where some of the same things will come up, and this is education technology. So I'll focus on, maybe for time, I'm going to skip over this, but there's some very interesting things that work with parents. Protom is doing this. Rocket Learning has some very exciting results with both parents, but also iron body workers. So I think just communication with parents and with iron body workers can be very effective. Here's an example of how this could be used for teachers. This is an AI education initiative. I'm mentioning these because everybody, I think, immediately thinks, well, education technology, that should go for students and be oriented, and I'll focus on that. But things going to parents or to teachers can also have a very important effect. This is teachers got lesson plans, very detailed lesson plans on tablet computers. And those included a lot of classroom management advice as well. So after 2 years, this was a primary school program, it was in private schools. We saw after 2 years, students had almost learned as much as they would normally learn in 3 years. And in the pre-primary level, after 2 years, they gained as much as students would normally learn in 3.5 years. So very, very large effect sizes. And we're currently evaluating a program in public schools. We don't yet have results from that. Okay, let me talk about something that's being done in India, where there are multiple studies. I'll share some results from our study, but I think they're very similar to results in other states. This was we were evaluating something that the government of Andhra Pradesh was doing, and we were working very closely with Central Square Foundation. So when we were asked to help evaluate a personalized adaptive learning program, basically what personalized adaptive learning programs do is they're designed to deal with a huge issue in education, which is heterogeneity in learning levels within the classroom. It's very easy for some students to fall behind. And if they fall behind, then it's very hard to catch up because you can't even understand what's going on in class. So that's a huge problem in many education systems around the world. Well, what personalized adaptive learning systems do is they try to assess what the student currently knows, and then tries to provide instruction tailored to their level to help them, if they're at the frontier, to help them advance from there, if they've fallen behind, to help them catch up. And what we found was that about just 1 hour, so initially there was low usage. The government of Andhra Pradesh was then, when they learned about the low usage, they took the data that was available from, because this is an education technology program, the provider, the firm, it's called Convergenius, that was providing the software in this case, they knew how much usage was because people had to log into the system. So they could report how much students were using this in different schools. That allowed the government to contact the schools where students were supposed to, this was supposed to be timetabled for 2 40-minute periods per week. Where it was much below that, they contacted the schools. And that led to a big increase in usage, not to the full amount, but at least an hour, at least roughly an hour a week. That led to a gain of really a doubling of educational progress, a doubling of the learning rate. And the effects were larger for younger students and for girls. So these were very impressive results. But the one thing we found is that the results were very much proportional to usage. So there were some schools that used these as per the timetable, others that had low usage, and the impact on test scores really depended very heavily on that. Now there's a couple of other studies. There's a study in Rajasthan of a different personalized adaptive learning program from another company, MindSpark. Very, very similar results. Very big gains, but again, they depend entirely on usage levels. So getting high usage is important. A third study was done of Khan Academy. So this was interesting because in that study, both the treatment group and the comparison group had the Khan Academy software. The difference wasn't whether they had the software. The difference was whether there was support provided to help get usage up. And there was very low usage if that support wasn't provided. Where the support was provided, there was usage and there was a gain in test scores. So the results seem very similar across contexts. So what's one lesson from this? There's huge, I think it's the same really across many of these sectors. There's opportunities from AI, but it will require not just for government services to improve, but it will require not just the technology, but thinking through how do you adapt the government systems to use them effectively. In this case, building on what in Rajasthan and with MindSpark and with the Khan Academy, there were high levels of special workers to increase usage at each school. That, I think that's worth considering as a policy, but my understanding is that policymakers are reluctant they don't consider that sustainable. What Andhra Pradesh did is that they just called the schools where there was a problem, and they got the data from the company. That system could be made much more automatic. So, headmasters could learn which teachers are using this. They could be given tickets, just like an information technology person in a firm would get them, saying, "Here's somebody who has a problem. Go try to help them." So they could get that, and then they would record when that was resolved. And if they weren't resolving things, then the block level officers could see that on their systems, and they could similarly get tickets and contact the headmasters. Same thing could go up at the district level or even all the way up to the state. The VSK system, that I think could be a very powerful tool, but it would require integrating in some of the EdTech data into VSK, and then this could be tried. Obviously, there are other things like budgeting for maintenance of hardware. If the hardware is not working, it's very hard to ask the school level officials to increase usage. Starting in earlier grades may also make sense because we saw bigger effects in earlier grades, but right now this hasn't been done for the primary levels, it's more at the middle school levels. But that maybe that would have to be done in some other way if the budget isn't there or if there are other obstacles. Thinking more broadly about EdTech, there's a lot of, I mentioned a few companies that are in this business, but it would ideally be, there could be potential for many more entrants in this. This is an area where, some of the companies are really focused on the private school market or selling to households because they don't see dealing with the government as that profitable necessarily. But it's very important for society that there be good software available, that there'd be competition in this to get higher quality, and there'd be evaluation so that the government can judge which products are the right ones to buy. How can you try to increase competition in this sector and improve product offerings? Well, could establish innovation labs or test beds for rapid experimentation. Central Square Foundation is working in this area. There could be some fund, and you could have a tiered evidence-based funding system with small amounts of money to pilot new ideas or develop new ideas, but then larger funds for rigorous impact evaluation. And then with that evaluation data, that could help inform governments about which ones to buy and allow transition to scale. You could also get more competition, perhaps, if you built AI tools to allow a product built for one state, for that state's curriculum and language, to be rapidly transferred over to match the curriculum and language for another state. I think ultimately it may be important to think through procurement mechanisms for this, as well as provide R&D funding and support. So, a lot of procurement is set up to focus on price for understandable reasons, but in buying technology, it's very important to think about quality as well, because the software is usually a very small part of the overall cost. There's the teacher's time, there's the children's time, there's the hardware. All of those things could be used much more effectively with good software. So designing procurement to take into account quality is important. You can have technical requirements to be impaneled, government's doing some of this. You have to worry a little bit to be locked into one firm. If one firm provides, then 3 years later when there's the next procurement, you may be stuck with that. So a few things may be useful for this. Requiring collection and sharing of data on usage, on learning outcomes, asking them to conduct A/B tests, and perhaps considering requiring them to make these open access. Obviously, you'd have to pay more for ad. Firms won't like it, they'll ask for more money, but perhaps it's worth doing that. It may be particularly worth doing that as part because there'll be benefits not just to that state, but for other states and for all of India. So maybe that's something that the center could think about doing, or offering more if that were done. Okay. Let me note something very innovative that Niti Aayog piloted in Uttar Pradesh. They had outcome-based payments for firms, where the amount the firm got was based on what the learning gains were, and they structured things to measure learning gains. That obviously produces incentives for continuous quality improvement, which is what, that will be very important as we get rapid technological change with AI. Not just what's the quality of the product at the beginning,
but you're really buying a system to improve this over time. Another approach would be having two-stage contracts, or perhaps even a single stage, but with multiple winners. So it's not that 100% of the supply goes to one firm, and then there's lock-in, and they have an advantage in the following year. Imagine you chose 3 different firms, or 2 different firms, and they were each allocated some schools where they would work. Then that would maybe the best bid gets 70% of the schools, or 80%, or even 90%. But if there's something for each of them, then that allows evaluation and comparison of the outcomes. And then when the next bid comes along, for the remaining schools in the state, or for the following 3 years later, it's easier there's more competition at that stage. This is something that if you're thinking about a big auto manufacturer, for example, they don't want a single supplier. They typically try to make sure there are multiple suppliers for this reason. This is something that governments might also consider doing. Okay, so let me conclude by suggesting a view of how we should think about experiments as part of policy. And I think several of the cases illustrate this. It's not really we evaluate the policy, we find out is it good or is it bad, and then we stop, and if it's bad, we shut it down, if it's good, we continue it. I think we should think of this as a part of a cycle of continuous improvement. So first, identifying the issues through discussion with a variety of stakeholders, having focus groups. Second, coming up with a list of candidate solutions. Typically, the government will have a bunch of solutions, but it's also worth talking to teachers, talking to students, talking to parents, seeing what other ideas they have. And also looking internationally, both within the sector, but also adjacent sectors, to see what's been tried and what's worked. Once there are some candidate solutions, the policymakers can decide which ones they want to test, and then refine them over time. And then the experimental method can be very useful for that. So for example, in the weather forecasting work, what's the message that's given to farmers? Well, the first messages that were tried, there were improvements tested to see what maximizes farmer comprehension, and things were learned. Don't just give a percentage probability of monsoon onset. Also describe that. It's a high chance, it's a low chance. That helped improve comprehension. Also express it as a ratio. 70% or 70 times out of 100. That also helped improve comprehension. And then scale up, but particularly in an age of AI and very rapid technological improvements, it's not going to be you scale up and you're done. Even something, I gave the example of all these ed tech cases. They all worked. 3 different companies, they all had successful products. But the challenge was to get usage on it. So then you need to start thinking about how do you integrate that into government systems. Well, there you could try multiple approaches, and you could test them, and you could improve them. And meanwhile, you should be also going through the next generation of software, which will be presumably even better. So I think if we can get this type of continuous improvement, we can have the opportunity for government to have, I believe, really tremendous productivity improvement in ways that will in some cases, bring down costs, but more important, will allow the government to provide better traffic safety to citizens, better education to citizens, safer water to citizens. And I think if all those things happen, then there's a lot of fear that AI is going to widen divides in the world, and it's going to make a few billionaires better off. And that might, I don't want to dismiss those fears, but I think if there's an active effort by governments, by social entrepreneurs, by researchers, it should be possible to harness the potential of AI to create a better life for all citizens. India is already a leader in this area. It's things like identity, the Aadhaar system, things that are going on in health, weather, it's leading traffic, it's it's making very rapid progress. I actually am optimistic about the future. Thank you.
We are still keeping Michael with us for a bit more for addressing any questions that any of you might have. So, does anyone want to raise an issue? Yes, please, at the back.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Dr. Amrita, faculty from Economics Department, Punjab University. So I had basically two questions. One is regarding research with AI. As far as secondary data analysis is concerned, that is being done overnight with AI. So we would as researchers, we would like to do primary listing. Our CTs are out of reach for most of the state university professors because we don't have the funding. They're too expensive. We don't get the funding. So how would you react to without so we could have some funding is a huge issue. So especially for state university individual researchers. So there are very serious problems which can very well be tackled through RCTs. But the monetary part is a very big constraint. That's one thing I want to. Second thing I want to ask you that how wise it is for a developing country to have an AI-led model, because already we have only 30% of employment in services. AI is going to very seriously hit services employment compared to others. So we've not even, we are already having the jobless growth. So that would put us even in a bigger trouble. So that this model, AI-led model, is more effective for a developed country where aging is already happening. For a developing country, it would be not such a wise decision to totally to shift to AI this thing so I just want your
Thank you.
Both AI and RCTs, it does. I think it does require some resources to conduct randomized controlled trials and to collect the data. Let me note a couple of things a few things ways to control the costs of this, but then let me also make the argument that it's a very wise investment for governments and philanthropy to make. One way to control the costs is to find contexts in which the government is going to introduce the program in a phased-in way in any case. So an example of this was in a very early example, prominent example, was Mexico had a very patchwork system of social safety net programs, and there was a lot of patronage involved. And Mexico decided that they were going to introduce conditional cash transfers, payments to households as long as they had their children in school and got basic health checks. What they did was, they knew they wanted to introduce this program. They knew they needed to pilot it in some villages anyway. They chose those villages randomly in a way that made it possible to compare the villages where there was early phase-in to ones where there was later phase-in. The overall, if this were done all funded through some research grant, it would have been extraordinarily expensive. But this was the government of Mexico introducing the program they would have introduced anyway. Same speed, but just the way they structured the rollout meant that it was possible to evaluate. So that doesn't work with every government policy, but there are many cases where governments, I think it would actually be very wise for governments to do that, because until you try something, you don't know whether it's going to work. There are many cases, I think this comes up all the time, where I've reported on some successful cases, but there are many programs one thinks will be successful and turn out not to be. And even the education technology case that I talked about, that was successful. But if it had been evaluated before the government started contacting the schools to increase usage, there would have been presumably no impact because the labs were not being used. So that's one way to reduce the cost. Another way to reduce the cost is to use electronic means of data collection or administrative data that the government's collecting anyway, or data that can be collected from satellite data, or data that is increasingly data is being collected electronically, for example, for BSK in schools. So that also can make it less expensive. But I think as the examples that I outlined indicated, the gains from having a successful program that is improved over time and that is rolled out to even a single state in India, but certainly all of India, those can be huge. And that means that investing in learning to develop the program, to refine the program, to make it better, it's actually a very wise investment. So I think this is an area where governments can provide support, and I think it's also a very important area for philanthropy to provide support. The other question was about an AI-led economic development strategy. I'm making somewhat more modest claims here. I'm not necessarily saying AI should be the entire basis for the economic strategy of any country. I think the government is already involved in certain sectors like education, healthcare, agricultural extension. If the government can harness the power of AI to do that more efficiently, then that can be very valuable for everybody. So I think that's an area where I think there's a strong case for government investment and involvement and philanthropic investment and involvement. I don't want to say that's the only area. It may make sense for government to do much more, but today I've talked about that fairly basic restricted case.
Economically harmful, rather than just being ethically concerning. What indicators would you watch?
Inequality, I think, is economically very harmful. Let me start with the most basic reason, and then I'll go on to others. If we think that the overall economic welfare is just the sum of the economic welfare of everybody in society, then if many citizens are poor, where their welfare would be greatly increased by just a small increase in income, there's a huge economic or welfare benefit from that. Probably so that's one thing. If you're looking for, and I think that's probably the most important way to think about that. But then, obviously people also care about what about overall GNP and so on. And that's also an important way to think about it. There, I think about the opportunities that people can have to contribute to society that they might not have if they're poor. I'll talk about the deworming case. This is medicine that costs 2 cents, 2 US cents, about 2 rupees. That's the cost of this medicine. People's earnings increased 13% more. Just the tax revenue on that would have been enough to pay for the entire program. So that's an example. It's not high-income people who get worms. If you're high income, you're probably wearing shoes. There's lots of reasons why it's low-income people who get these worms. The economic gains, purely in terms of GNP, purely in terms of tax revenue, would pay for the entire program. I think if you think about information for farmers as well, the cost of that program, the government sent out 3.8 crore messages. The cost per farmer was 40 paisa. So the benefits, there might be something like a half-hectare farm on average. That's 1,000 rupees, roughly. The cost of the telco costs are 40 paisa. These are huge opportunities for economic gains by addressing some of the constraints that are preventing the poor from educating themselves as much as they would like or maximizing the productivity of their farms.
The first one is when you say that we want to design personalized curriculums, how are we designing those? Was that also part of your research? Is it also through AI or is it through humans training AI? And then did you consider if there's going to be a bias when, for example, a teacher is training AI to design a personalized curriculum for any student. And then the second one was around outcomes. So again, like how are you assessing these outcomes? Is it only AI or is it through like a teacher or anybody at like an educational level assessing how learning is improving among students? And then I also had just one more follow-up question to what Dr. Amrita was talking about when you said that it's good to invest in RCTs. With the rapid speed in which AI is moving, and we all know that RCTs are like a longer time period of research. How do you think we will sort of like keep up with technology rapidly changing, and then so many external factors coming up in the research we designed way back, and that's sort of like affecting our research? Thank you.
Great. So first, the evaluations that I reported on, they're from human development. The researchers, the economic researchers who are evaluating them were not developing the products. There was, one of them was, there were two edtech firms in India, plus Khan Academy, and those were developed, I think, primarily through traditional human means plus software, traditional software development. But I think in all three cases, these firms or nonprofit organizations are now moving to use AI to produce new versions of their products that will do a better job of responding to where the student is and where the student needs to be, or where they can most benefit from additional instruction, or how to target the instruction to the particular problem that the student is having. Let me be a little bit more concrete. I think the previous software has been focusing on just the overall level of the student. Can they handle two-digit addition, two-digit subtraction, and then trying to situate them and adjust the learning level to that. Well, you could do even more. You could try to analyze the pattern of answers the student is having and understand where they're making a mistake, and then tailor the instruction to the specific type of mistake that the student's making. Maybe they can't carry digits, maybe they're confusing multiplication and addition or something like that. Different types of trials that can be done, very different time scales. So if you're interested, some of them you can get very rapid feedback. I gave the example of trying to test what types of message, how do you phrase a message to farmers to maximize farmer comprehension. So that can be done very, very rapidly. Or if you're thinking about, imagine you have the EdTech app going and you're testing, okay, we found some students who doesn't seem to be able to carry digits and subtraction problems. We have two videos. We developed 2 or 3 videos, and we want to see how well which one of those videos does better for students in that situation. Well, you can get very rapid feedback. Give 500 students one video, 500 students another video. You get feedback the same day possibly on whether when you go back and give them some problems they can understand it. And then maybe test the following week as well.
Much longer. If you want to observe educational performance over a year, you have to wait a year. But I think through a combination of these approaches, we can learn over time. And there are some other ideas out there, like looking for markers of long-run effects. So this is used in health. If you're looking at 5-year cancer survival rates, that takes 5 years to wait. But you might be able to pick up a biomarker that's a good test for 5-year cancer. So there may be opportunities in other fields to do something similar.
My question is, like, across the country, ours is a federal country, and we have different state capacities in different states. So as a policymaker, how should we adapt an RCT proven intervention in one state to another state so that the treatment effects are once?
Professor Kremer, gratitude for the speech. Thank you very much, and august audience. I am Professor Devesh. I work for Chandigarh University, and I am the 5th generation educationist. So the question is, my parents, grandparents have worked in schools, and they have told me that there's a problem or there's a pain in India that many people have to drop their education after the school and impacts employability. However, if they are able to continue to college and post-grad, the employability increases. To my understanding, it is the competency that lacks in the school that they build in the higher education system. Your PAL is exceptional. American systems like accreditation, assurance of learning, WCAP are marvelous. Any message to the people who are supporting the schools? How can they work on competencies at school level that enhance their employment?
In schools, beyond schools, and I think this is an area where technology is increasingly opening up opportunities. For example, seeing some encouraging work on adult education with apps. One thing that I think is generally very useful is finding a way to get the combination of the human element and the technology element. If you just go with the technology alone, that often just don't get very high usage rates of that. So for example, massive online open courses got a lot of attention 10, 15 years ago, but they find that these are just videos of very good lecturers giving lectures, and they thought this would replace higher education at some point, but in fact, most students, they start them, but they stop after a while. So thinking about how to integrate in both the human element and the technology element, I think is important. I think that's one of the reasons why teacher-directed approaches were useful. But there may be ways to do this in creative ways. Mentioned Rocket Learning. They have things that they're sending to Anganwadi workers. For a young child, obviously, you can't count on them to use the technology by themselves. But if the Anganwadi workers have good instructions, then they can do a better job of teaching. So I think there's all sorts of opportunities for adult education, preschool education, everything in between. On the issue of adapting things from one context to another, I think it's useful to look at a range of experience and see what patterns stand out, but then to think about the local context. First, we think about what are the issues in the local context. In some parts of the world, girls' education is a particular problem. In other parts of the world, girls are actually staying in school more than boys, and there are other issues that might be the big issue. Maybe it's labor market issues in terms of gender inequality. So thinking about what are the problems in each area, thinking about what the evidence is, and then just knowing the context well, and thinking about how you might try things, and perhaps pilot it in a specific new context to understand how things are working. Sometimes that can be done with an RCT, sometimes just a small pilot, even without an RCT, will uncover obvious things that need to be adapted and changed. But it requires some, one phrase is, locally grounded and globally informed, and that's, I think, what policy would ideally be both. And then now I'm sorry. Can you remind me the first question of the topic?
How can advanced market awareness enhance technology?
Right. Yes, I'd love to follow up. There are two on this very specific issue of stubble burning. I've seen some very interesting papers on this. And one of the papers was about payments to farmers for not burning stubble. One of the issues was, and it actually found a lot of success. The time, it argued the timing of the payments and the structure of the payments was very important. But another thing they pointed out was that, or they think is important, is what's the technology for measurement? Because if you're going to make payments based on stubble, not burning stubble, you need to measure that in a very short period of time at a very large scale. And the idea was perhaps there's ways to do that through larger units, through a cooperative or through a payment for a contract or something like that, that would so you could just do sampling rather than try to cover every individual area. That's speculative. That might be one approach. Or to harness technology and do better satellite measurement
get at stubble burning. Another approach was just to subsidize some of the inputs to reduce stubble burning. And I saw a recent paper, I'm blanking on the citation, but I could try to look it up and we could talk afterwards, about a particular, and that also looked, very successful, at least after 1 year of data collection.
Thank you. I know there are still a lot of hands up, but we are really out of time. And I just hope Professor Kremer has had a lovely preview of this beautiful city and its lovely people, and will come again. But for now, we need to hand over to the vote of thanks.
We just had an intellectually stimulating oration by Professor Michael Kremer, followed by a robust Q&A session. Professor Kremer's lecture exemplifies the power of combining intellectual rigor, methodological innovation, and policy engagement. We are enriched by his insights on experimentation, innovation, and the future of development policy in India. His commitment towards building capacity of less developed countries and the state governments in India in dealing with various issues of health, education, climate change, agricultural practices, etc. is remarkable. I, on behalf of CRRID, CCF, and MGSIPA, am grateful to him for delivering such a thought-provoking and enlightening discourse on a very pertinent issue of economics and policy innovation in India. It bridges economic theory with practical solutions for challenges facing the Indian economy from time to time. I am thankful to all those present here from different walks of life and academia, including the friends from media and the students, for sparing their valuable time. I am sure each one of you have gained immensely on this relatively less discussed issue of policy engagements. I once again thank Professor Kremer and his team for sparing time out of their pressing engagements. Last but not the least, I am thankful to Ms. Vinny Mahajan for successfully persuading Professor Kremer to come here and share how he is working with governments in many critical areas in India. Thank you.